Welcome to the microphone, Tim Canova.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction. I want to correct one thing that Lulu said. She said, this is something that happened to Tim's election. This wasn't just my election. What happened here in Broward County 2 years ago happened to our election. Yes. If there was a, I was going to say, thank you. I was going to say if there was a crime that was committed, I shouldn't say if, there was crimes committed actually. And I'm not the only victim. The voters of Broward County will never get to see the ballots that were cast on August 30th, 2016. I'll just say a few words about the campaign and the aftermath with the ballot destruction case. Many of you know it was quite an epic campaign, David versus Goliath. We built up an enormous field operation, and we were able to raise the resources, only by raising money online and small donations. And we plowed so much of the money back into the district. We had 4 field offices. We had an army of field organizers and volunteers knocking on 10,000 to 12,000 doors a week in the August heat of 2016. Now, and I think in addition to that, the phone banking operation was significant, about 2,000 to 3,000 phone calls a week. This may have been the largest grassroots field operation in the country for any congressional district. And sometime in August of that year, my field director started to report that the numbers that they were recording started to tip, started to shift in our favor. The day before the election, August 29th, my brother and Richard Bell, the chief of staff, they were, I believe, out at dinner, and somebody looked at a screenshot. I wasn't there, so I don't really know how it came to their attention. But the local NBC6 had a preview of the next day's elections. And each of the elections were zeroed out. Each of the candidates 0% with 0 precincts reporting, except our race, which showed Wasserman Schultz beating us, or ahead of us, 58 to 42 with 69% of precincts reporting. And that always struck us as very strange, to say the least. And we called up, and NBC took down that screenshot. Never to this day have we even gotten an explanation. The next day, all of the voting sites, this reminds me of what Kathy Lehrman was saying, her experience and her daughter Candace's experience and the Richard Mendelson campaign's experience this recent primary election. We had a similar experience. Every early voting site and every election day, primary election day site we went to, it felt like we were winning a landslide. Now that's anecdotal, so you don't really know if it's reflecting the reality. But then election night, we lost by 13 percentage points, about 6,000 or so votes, and it struck us as very strange. I started to hear from election experts, including Lulu, not long after the results were in. I think the biggest mistake I made was not actually contesting the election. It was one of the very few times I really listened to the political consultants, and I regret it very deeply. But I recovered my wits about me, I'd say, and we started to put in these public records requests with Lulu really spearheading the entire effort. I think the first request she put in was in November of 2016. 3 requests later, 7 months later, 7 months of stonewalling by the Supervisor of Elections, we filed a lawsuit in June of 2017. Under Florida's public records law, everybody here, every resident of Florida has the right to inspect public documents under the public records law. Ballots are public documents. That's also a Florida state constitutional right. Well, the lawsuit itself was something else. I think in late August of 2017, we served Supervisor Snipes with discovery requests, and those requests were to inspect the paper ballots. 3 days later, we would find out, several months later, 3 days later, she signed a destruction order to destroy all of the ballots in violation of federal and state criminal statutes. In the destruction order, she certified that the ballots were not the subject of pending litigation. Of course they were. I should back up and say, at the very beginning, in November of 2016, and Lulu, correct me if I have any of this wrong, my recollection is we asked to see the digital scanned images and we're told they didn't do digital scanned images in the race, which also struck us as strange because you take the paper ballots and literally put them through a scanning machine, so why wouldn't you take digital images? So a year later, when we wanted to inspect the paper ballots, we weren't expecting digital scanned images. Again, she destroyed the ballots in September of 2017. We weren't aware of it. We were moving forward to actually inspect the ballots, and I think it was in late October when Lulu came back down here for a couple of days of inspection, and at that point, Lulu and our small team were told, well, you can't see the paper ballots. They didn't say why, but you can inspect the digital scanned images. What? You've got digital scanned images all of a sudden? So, again, rather perplexing. In open court, we have hearing transcripts a few days later. The lawyer for the Supervisor of Elections admitted to destroying the paper ballots after concealing it from the court for 2 months, and offered to give the court sworn affidavit by Debbie Wasserman Schultz to try to stop the litigation. We've never gotten an explanation of that as well. After we took the videotape deposition of Brenda Snipes and she admitted to the ballot destruction there, and after the Florida Circuit Court granted a summary judgment, at that point I went back and looked at those final field numbers, and it shows a landslide for us. Now, field numbers can be skewed for all kinds of reasons, but I'll say I was very proud of those couple of hundred people who were knocking on those doors, and I know some of you are here. A lot of you put in a lot of sweat in that campaign, and it showed a landslide for us. Now, I felt it in my gut. I never really felt defeated. I never really felt that it was a fair result, and yet I went along with it. And why? Because there's a certain type of denial, I think. It's almost like a child who's taught to believe in Santa Claus. You're taught to believe that the election officials would not actually rig election results like this. So it's been an eye-opening experience for me. I thought when the Florida Circuit Court granted a summary judgment and the supervisor had admitted to the destruction, that of course the Republicans in this state and nationally would respond. That perhaps the Florida governor would fire the supervisor, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement would start an investigation. None of that happened. The Justice Department, as far as I know, and the U.S. Attorney are not investigating as far as I know. And it took a while for the word to get back to me. It's because they have the same financial backers that Wasserman Schultz has, which paints a very sad picture, doesn't it? That it's really one party out there, the party of money, at least at the establishment level. And sometimes they wear blue shirts and sometimes they wear red shirts. That's what we're fighting against. And you can imagine how depressing this was. It's depressing to lose a campaign, but that's something I could get over, that many people get over. I was an athlete growing up, cross country and track. I was used to losing a lot of races. You get over it and you move on. But there was something else about this. It was losing the confidence that we have in democracy. And I remember, thank you. I wrote to all of the Democratic Party officials asking them to join me in a call for an investigation, and none responded, and that in itself was very disturbing. It's not a culture of democracy, it's an authoritarian culture if nobody's willing to step out and defy what the party leaders want. And I've said many times that doesn't sound like a democracy, it sounds a lot like organized crime. You can imagine it's difficult to get out of the bed in the morning and keep campaigning when you realize they may have gotten away with rigging an election. They certainly got away with a cover-up with getting rid of those ballots. The digital scanned images, you can't inspect the software, so I'm not sure what good they are. These experts here can talk about that issue much better than I can. And I remember saying to my mother, it feels a lot like Groundhog Day. Got to get up in the morning and it's the same reality. If this is a crime scene, and John Brakey said, you went from an election scene to a crime scene. Yep. By being a candidate again, I had to relive this every day at the crime scene. And I also said it felt a lot like High Noon. Yeah. That movie High Noon where you're sort of out there, Gary Cooper's out there on the main street, the bad hombres are coming into town, and there's no one there to help them. Well, I'll tell you, it felt like High Noon until recently. You know, this group that has arrived here for this conference is like coming to the rescue. They're angels coming to the rescue. And Kathy Lehrman and Candace Lehrman and their law firm, Angels to the Rescue. Yeah. I certainly don't feel all that alone here fighting this big machine anymore. And I think this is the beauty of it. You know, so many bad things happen to people in this world, and it's easy to forget that when bad things happen, sometimes there's a blessing in there. And the blessing here, you know, if we had won that race against Wasserman Schultz, that would have been one of the greatest political upsets of the last few decades. It's easy to feel cheated. It's easy to feel like, you know, what was lost. I'm not sure what was lost. If I had been a member of Congress, I'm not sure what I'd accomplished with this Congress. But I'll tell you what was gained was the insight into how corrupt this election system is we have in this country. And when I decided not to drop out of the race, knowing that they could rig it again, the reason I decided not to drop out of the race is because I'm committed to exposing as much of this corruption as I can and to educating voters on this issue as much as I can. I'd like to give a shout out to a man in the back row there, if he'll raise his hand, Clint Curtis. Clint Curtis, way back in 2004, he discovered a lot of this. He went through it, he lived through it. He ran for Congress and they rigged it against him. And I guess that's my way of saying, if they could do it here in Broward County, and I know Benny Smith mentioned the machines, the fractional magic, 99% of the machines in this country have the capacity to be hacked this way or manipulated.
I would note that Clint was the first person to build it.
Clint Curtis built it, and that's a story in itself. He didn't think he was building it for the wrong reasons. He thought he was building it for somebody who was going to expose how easy it was to corrupt the election system. You know, I'll just conclude by saying it's been an education experience for me. I've learned a lot. I've come to believe the only way to reform this system is to have a system of 100% hand-marked paper ballots that are counted by hand in public. They do this all over Europe. They've banned the electronic voting machines and they have paper ballots that are counted by hand in public. I think that's what we need here. I want to make a public service announcement about the Florida surrender rule. So I've been learning a lot about this. If you get an absentee ballot in the mail and you decide not to fill it out and mail it in, and you go to an election site to vote in person, whether it's early voting or election day, they will not let you cast a ballot because you've had an absentee ballot sent to you. And correct me if I've got this wrong, please. So they will basically ask you to fill out a provisional ballot. And there's a big history of the provisional ballots. Apparently they're counted last, and that opens up a lot of opportunities for manipulation in the vote count of the provisional ballots. And I'm not sure if they're audited quite the same way as regular ballots. John Brakey's shaking his head no. So the experts—
I don't think they audit anything here.
Yeah,
And what
not
they
in
do is a
Florida,
crime,
yeah.
after what I witnessed.
Yeah. So as a result, if folks out there have absentee ballots, bring it with you to early voting or election day if you're voting. And I'll say one other thing. A big, I'd say, theme in our campaign, aside from election integrity, has been how dangerous the trend has been in recent decades to seem to privatize everything. Yeah. K-12 public schools, our transit systems, our waterworks, our sewage systems. Well, we've already privatized our election counting systems. These are private vendors hired by the Supervisor of Elections of Broward County that create the software that can be manipulated. And if you want to see the software, you can't because it's private property of those companies. That's privatization run amok. We've seen the First Amendment being privatized in recent weeks, where we count on Facebook and Twitter to decide whether my campaign will be throttled and shadow banned. So this privatization trend has to end. We have to reclaim our own elections. Again, I'll just conclude by saying that the blessing in all of this has been that it has woken me up. We all have to be woken up to the threats to our election system. They're beyond threats. It's now the rot in the election system. Stay awake and wake up others. Thank you so much.